Hello, grade 12 students. Here we move again to our nervous system. Exactly, chapter 10, the mitotic reflex exercises. So in this video, we're going to solve the exercises related to the mitotic reflex, and let's start with exercise 2. Document 1 represents 4 nerve pathways, A, B, C, and D, connecting the corresponding muscles to the nerve center. Here in document 1, stimulation are done on these pathways by the help of stimulating electrodes. These electrodes, they are stimulating electrodes S1, S2, S3, and S4 as seen here. So the results are given in document 2. So let's see the experiment. Stimulation in S1, it causes the contraction of muscle A. Stimulation in S2, contraction of muscle B. In S3, contraction of muscle A. In S4, contraction of muscle B. So here, the neuromuscular spindle that correspond to the pathway C, this one, S3, correspond to pathway C is that of muscle A. So in S3, we have the contraction of the muscle A. Since the stimulations A and C lead to the contraction of A, so S1 and S3, they lead to the contraction, both of them, contraction of A. While the neuromuscular spindle that correspond to the pathway D, this pathway S4, is that of muscle B. Why? Since the stimulation in S2, it leads to the contraction of muscle B, and the stimulation in S4 leads to the contraction of muscle B. So if they match each neuromuscular spindles with its muscle, we're already done. Indicate the sensory pathways and the motor pathway. The pathways A and B, they are the motor one, and while C and D, they are the sensory one. Why do we say that the muscles A and B, they are antagonist? A and B, they are antagonist. So let's see here, A and B. A and B, they are antagonists, mean that they act in the opposite. One of them is relaxing, the other is contracting. So if you see here, the contraction in S3 and S4, we did a strong stimulation in S3 and in S4. So none of these muscles contract. So either both of them, they are going to relax, so they are not antagonists, so they are antagonist. So none of the muscles react, meaning that both should simultaneously contract. This is impossible. This doesn't happen. So when one muscle contract, the antagonist should relax. That's why they are called antagonists. Okay? Move to the solution. Exercise number 1, the neuromuscular spindle that corresponds to pathway C is that of muscle A. So the stimulations in pathways A and C lead to the contraction of muscle A. While the neuromuscular spindle that corresponds to pathway D is that of muscle B. So the stimulations in pathways B and D lead to the contraction of muscle D. Part B, the pathways, as we said, A and B, they are motor, while C and D, they are sensory. So the simultaneous stimulations in S3 and S4, they block the activity of both muscles, A and B. Both should simultaneously contract. This is impossible. So when one muscle contracts, the other should relax. The antagonist should relax. Let's move to exercise 3. So in exercise 3, a man sits with his 2 legs hanging. Using a hammer, we strike with one blow the patellar tendon of one leg, and the leg is seen to be kicked forward. The next figure represents the muscles involved in this activity. So an experimental study of this reflex shows that a fast stretching of the anterior muscle of the thigh, M1, provokes a contractile reaction of this muscle. So they said, name this reflex. What do we call this reflex? Sure, it's called the myotatic reflex. Why? Because the muscle contracts upon its stretching. You have to study this and you have to know this. An accidental or microbial lesion of the spinal cord or of certain roots of spinal nerves change this response or even removes it. So knowing that the center of this reflex, sure, is the spinal cord. Explain why this data is not enough to confirm it. Design experiment. Sure, it's not enough because the spinal cord, it's to prove that the spinal cord is only reflex center. Here, In order to prove that the spinal cord is the only center or the center of this reflex, we have to isolate the spinal cord from the brain. If there is no response, so we deduce that the spinal cord is the center of this reflex. So this data is not enough to confirm it. So you have to build an experiment where the spinal cord is isolated, it's removed, or it's disconnected, let's say, from the brain. If there is no response detected, so the spinal cord will be the center of this reflex. Part C. Specify the role of each of the two muscles, M1 and M2, in this reflex. The M1 muscle is an extensor muscle, since when we do a percussion, it provokes its contraction. So this results, or this contraction leads to the movement of the muscle forward, while the muscle M2, it's a flexor muscle. Flexor, since it relaxes, permitting the leg to project forward. So the M1 is called an extensor muscle, while that is called a flexor one. What is the importance of this type of reflex? This type of reflex is very important in order to protect the body against either over contraction or over extension. So you have to be careful about this. So let's move to the solution. The first part, they said, what is the type of, or name the studied reflex, justify your answer. It's a myotatic reflex, as we said, since the muscle contracts upon its stretching. The part B, they said that knowing that the center of this reflex is the spinal cord, how can we explain that this, how can we design an experiment to verify this? Taking into consideration that the data is not enough. We said that the given data is not enough to prove the spinal cord is the only reflex center. So they indicate the necessity of spinal cord in such a reflex, because when it's stopped, the response is stopped. So we have to add an experiment which the spinal cord is isolated or it's disconnected from the brain. If there is no response, so we deduce that the spinal cord is the center of this reflex. Part 3, to specify the type of each of the muscles M1 and M2. We said the muscle M1 is the extensor, since the percussion of its tendon provokes its own contraction. This contraction leads to the movement of the leg forward, while M2 is called a flexor, since it relaxes, permitting the movement of the leg forward. Part D, what is the importance of such a reflex? It helps in the protection in the body, especially the muscles for sure, against overextension or over contraction. Here we move to exercise 4. In exercise 4, we have in a spinal animal, we section the tendon that fixes the extensor muscle below the patella. The extremity which is cut is connected to a system that records the tension in the muscle. The other extremity remains connected normally to its bone insertion at the hip. We keep intact the innervation of this muscle. So document 1, it shows the experimental setup used. So at time equals 0, we stretch this extensor muscle. So we stretch the extensor muscle. Here we have stretching of the extensor muscle, and we keep it stretched during the whole time of an experiment. In S, where is S? Here it's S. In S, which stretch the flexor here. We stretch the flexor muscle, which is kept stretched till the end of the reordering. Document 2 shows the response of this muscle to stretching. They said, interpret the curve that shows the variation of the tension in the extensor muscle during the different stages. So before stretching, there is a permanent contraction, about 0.2 gram force. This is called muscular tenacity, as we said before. So when we stretch the extensor muscle by lowering the table, so the muscle responds by increase in its tension that reaches about 2 kilogram force. Okay, and it remains constant as long as stretching is performed. So what does this indicate? This indicates that the stretching of the muscle stimulates its own contraction. Upon stretching now the flexor muscle in S, okay, stretching the flexor muscle in S at time equal about 2 seconds here, the tension in the extensor muscle decreases to reach the minimum or limiting value about 1 kilogram force and remains constant at this. So meaning that there is an adjustment of the contraction of the extensor that becomes less contracted following the stretching of the flexor. What does this indicate? This indicates that the tension in the flexor muscle is inversely proportional to that of the flexor muscle. Part B, they said what nerve center is responsible for this reaction? This is a spinal animal, so the nerve center is the spinal cord. Part C, explain the role of the nerve center in the variation of the recording during the muscular or the muscle activity. So here the spinal cord provokes a coordination between the responses of the flexor and the extensor muscles. So this coordination is due to the contraction of the extensor and the relaxation of the flexor, and due to the increase in the tension of the extensor resulting from the stretching of its antagonist. So here the extensor receives two messages. One of them is inhibitory and the other is excitatory. So let's make the correction. Exercise 4, part A. Before stretching, there is a slight permanent contraction to about 0.2 kilogram force. So this is what we call by muscular tenacity. When we stretch the extensor muscle by lowering the table, the muscle responds by rapid increase in its tension that reaches 2 kilogram force in less than 1 second. This tension decreases slightly and stabilizes as long as stretching is maintained. What does this indicate? This indicates that the stretching of the muscle provokes its own contraction. While upon stretching the flexor muscle in S at t equal 2 seconds, the tension in the extensor muscle decreases to reach a limiting value about 1 kilogram force, and it remains unstabilized at this. So there is an adjustment of the contraction of the extensor that becomes less contracted following the stretching of the flexor. What does this indicate? This indicates that the tension in the flexor is inversely proportional to that of the flexor. What is the nerve center involved in such a reaction or reflex? The nerve center of this reflex is the spinal cord, which is the only center left, and since it's the spinal animal. So, role of the spinal cord provokes coordination between responses of the flexor and the extensor muscles. This is possible through the intervention of the polysynaptic neural circuits due to the presence of interneurons. This coordination is due to the contraction of the extensor muscle and the relaxation of the flexor one, and also due to the decrease in tension of extensor resulting from the stretching of its antagonist. So the extensor muscle receives two messages. One of them is excitatory due to its own stretching, and the other is inhibitory due to the stretching of its antagonist. So the cell body of alpha motor fibers neuron of the extensor integrate these messages and send the proper response. Now we move to exercise 5. Exercise 5, based on the represented setup shown in document 1, we ask a person to carry on extension and flexion movements of the foot. Here, using a special system of electromicrogram and using special convenient electrodes, we place on the legs, we record the whole electric phenomena that accompany the contractions of antagonist muscles, the triceps ray TS and the tibialis anterior TA. The recordings they are given in document 2. The upper tracing is that of the triceps muscle. So this one is for the triceps ray and the lower one is for tibialis anterior. So the upper tracing is that of the triceps muscle that contracts when a person stands on the tip of his foot, extension of the foot during the AB period. So during AB we have the extension, and at the lower tracing, this one is that of the tibialis anterior that contracts when the person lowers the heels. So during CD period we have flexion of the foot. So what can you deduce after analyzing these curves? So tracing AB show the recording in a response where in TS in the triceps array and not in the TA in the tibialis anterior. This shows that triceps array is contracted while this one TA during this period is relaxed. There is no response. So this is tibialis triceps array. So we have the extension of the foot. So this period during AB, this is extension of the foot. Tracing CD show the recording we have only in the tibialis anterior and not in the triceps array. So this is the period of the flexion. Okay, so this is the period of the flexion, meaning that the tibialis anterior is contracted. So this is the flexion of the foot. So each period of muscle contraction corresponds to the decrease in the activity of its antagonist. So one of them relaxes, the other contracts. So the movement of the foot, here we can deduce that it needs the movement of or the participation of two antagonist muscles, the flexor one and the extensor one. So here, as I said, tracing AB shows the recording of a response in triceps array and no response in tibialis. So this shows that triceps array is contracted while TA is relaxed. So one of them is contracted, the other is relaxed. So it's the period of the extension of the foot. While in tracing CD, it shows the recording of response in tibialis anterior and not in triceps array. So this shows that TA is contracted while TS is relaxed. So one of them relaxed, the other contract. So it's the period of the flexion where the TA is contracted. As such, each period of the muscle contraction corresponds to the decrease of the activity of the antagonist muscle, the one that relaxes. So hence, each movement of the muscle needs the cooperation of two antagonist muscles, the flexor one and the extensor one. Okay guys, thank you for watching this video.